Gateways to Democracy, An Introduction to American Government. Chapter 1, Gateways to American Democracy, Part 1 of 2. Slide 1, Learning Objectives. As we go through these, let's look at what they are and describe their content, but let's also think a little bit more deeply about them. First objective, identifying the successes we have achieved and the obstacles we face in establishing a, quote, more perfect union, unquote. What do we mean by a perfect union? Not even a matter of perfect. What do we mean by a union? Does that mean that we all share the same beliefs? That we are all united? If that's the case, what happens to individuality? We're going to look a little bit about this and think about what we mean by we the people of the United States, and what that means about individuals who feel that they think differently, or they don't feel like they're part of the perfect union. They don't think they're part of we the people, and what exactly happens to those people. Second, analyze how the constitutional system balances liberty and order. What do we mean by liberty? What do we mean by order? We can say that they're in tension with one another. They balance each other out somehow. But the thing about it is that it's not as though we know what liberty is and we know what order is and then we place them directly in some sort of opposition to each other. It's a question of what we mean by liberty. How do we define what liberty is? How do we define what order is? When you think about when there are people protesting the way that government is operating or government policies, some people will see that, right, as an example of liberty, of freedom, of people looking to change the existing system. Other people will see it as a matter of disorder, a matter of the way that we do things crumbling in some way. There is no absolute definition of these two, and it isn't really so much a matter of, again, balancing them. It's a matter of whether any particular action is coded as being liberty, freedom, or perhaps a threat to order. And so the fight that you often see, right, is not between those two, but to define a particular action and argue whether it's a matter of freedom and whether the existing order should be undermined in some way. Third, describe the political values and ideologies Americans share. What do we mean by shared values? How far down do you have to go in terms of our core values till you find a commonality? Does it mean that we all believe in that? When we say shared, does every one of us have to believe in a particular value or a particular ideology? Can there be individuality? Can you step outside of the political values and ideologies Americans share? And perhaps a deeper question is, do we even understand and know the source of our own political values? Do we see everything through a particular lens, through a particular ideology? So we'll have to think not only what we mean by values and ideologies, but in particular what we mean by share. Because on the one hand, that can sound very promising. We all have a commonality of belief, but if you're outside of the shared belief, of the dominant belief, that shared belief can seem very oppressive. Fourth, evaluate American democracy in terms of responsiveness and equality. Well, we're going to have to talk a little bit as we go through the course about what we mean by equality. We'll talk a lot about that, actually. And the fact that we're a country that believes in equality, states we believe in equality, but as you'll see as we go through the course, America has a very problematic past when it comes to dealing with people who aren't part of the dominant majority. It's one thing to simply say, well, we have this value and we haven't lived up to it. But it goes deeper than that, I think. Because what does it mean to say that you hold on to a value, even at the same time you perhaps don't seem to be practicing it? It means that you've taken that value, in this case equality, and defined it, interpreted it in particular ways, so that you can engage in certain actions that might in a later period of time seem to be very unequal, yet at the time that you're engaging those actions, you truly believe, right, that you are being evocative of equality and that you are a person who believes in equality. So again, we're going to see here it's a matter very much of interpretation and how we give meaning to a term such as equality. Fifth, list the responsibilities of individuals in a democracy. We'll be looking at this in terms of what we think individuals should be doing in democracy and what we think they're capable of doing. Some people will argue that all people are capable of doing is voting. That's about it. You can give them a couple of candidates, they can look between them, but they'll never understand the complexity of issues. Other people argue that because we have a system which only requires us to vote and doesn't seem to require us to get down to the basic knowledge or understanding of complex issues, we don't require that of people. That's why people don't do it. So it's really a question of whether we're talking about responsibilities in terms of participating in an existing system, voting, those kinds of things, or whether we think it has to do with individuals acquiring some kind of knowledge or some kind of understanding. So as you can see, all these learning objectives, which seem fairly neutral as you read through them, actually point to much more complex issues. And as I've indicated, that's one of the things we're going to be doing in this course, is always looking at the tensions, the contradictions, the balances, which underlie the terms and conceptions that seem to found our country. Slide 2, evaluating the American political system. You'll notice here a listing, right, of different factors grouped under successes and failures. This is the way your text groups these things. And you'll notice, I think, that there's a lot of contradictions here, right, between the first list under successes and the second list under failures. For example, we note here, right, tolerance and commitment to civil rights under successes, right, and yet under failures are racial tensions and cultural, religious, ethnic distrust. So how are we supposed to look at these contradictions? Well, I think one way to consider it is to look at the list of successes and view them as aspirational. Those are concepts, right, that we believe in, that we aspire to as Americans. The second list are the applications of those values and those beliefs. And as we can see, there's definitely a tension there between the aspirational belief and its application. So what's interesting in this list, or these lists, is not just going through them and memorizing all these different factors. The interesting part actually exists right in that little space, that empty space between successes and between failures. And to understand how success relates to failure, in other words, how a belief, a concept, relates to its application. And when the application doesn't seem to match what many consider the value to be, then you have to look at how the value is being interpreted, how it's being used, and how it's being applied. So it really isn't helpful simply to say, oh, look, there's a failure here to live up to these values, but rather how a system functions, which has these values, which people claim that they believe in, even if the applications seem a little problematic. Slide 3. Public policy stages. You'll notice here this slide begins with a fairly formal definition of what public policy is. What government does or does not do about a problem that comes before them for consideration and possible action. You'll notice that I highlighted the term problem, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So the first stage is identifying the problem, deciding what a problem is, right, and what is at the core of it. The second is placing the problem on the agenda of policymakers, bringing it to the attention of people, have it actually be part of the considered policy agenda. Third is formulating a solution. The fourth is enacting and implementing, putting the solution into effect. And the fifth part is evaluating the effectiveness of the solution. I'd suggest to you that steps 2, 3, 4, and 5, right, are really dependent on step 1, identifying the problem. What constitutes a problem? Understand, we're not talking about this in a metaphysical sense. In other words, in some abstract conceptual way, whether something looks like it's a problem even if government hasn't paid attention to it. What we're really talking about here is, when does something become a political problem? When does it rise to a level where it looks like the government actually has to deal with something? That's a very complicated question, because not only does an issue have to arise for the government to say, yeah, that's something we have to look at, but then they have to decide what actually is the problem. For example, Is it something structural? Is it something systemic? Or is it an individual problem? That makes a very big difference, whether you're going to look to change a system or whether you think it's something to deal with individuals who are somehow faulty or not interacting with the system properly. And I would suggest to you that this notion of identifying the problem is in itself very contentious. And whether something rises to a problem or whether it's something that's there that some people might point to but doesn't have the force behind it in which it becomes an actual political problem. Slide 4. How do we determine what is a quote-unquote problem? And you'll notice the subheading on this is the social and political contexts of public policy. How does something rise to be a problem? Here in this slide, we're looking at homelessness. Homelessness has been with us for many, many decades. And yet, for a long time, it was considered to be a problem of individuals who just couldn't fit in some way, that the system was fine, that the assistance that was needed was there, that there was no reason why anyone should be homeless unless it was for some sort of individual deficiency. And it is only within the recent, perhaps last couple of decades, that we've begun to see homelessness as a social problem, as a systemic problem. That there's nothing wrong with the people, there's something wrong with a system which ends up with that many homeless people. Let me give you an example. In Los Angeles County, there are nearly 60,000 residents that are homeless. The county has put forth an initiative to deal with the housing problem, with the homeless crisis.
So we organize this march between us, Monday Night Mission, and LA on Cloud 9. And the whole purpose of it is to help pass Measure H, which is on the county ballot on March 7th. It's going to generate up to over $350 million a year towards mental health rehab services, substance abuse rehab services, and other services that our homeless population in LA need to stay housed and come out of come out of issues that they have, whether it be mental illness or substance abuse. And the other thing that we were doing this for is to send the message out that homelessness in LA can be solved, and we want people to believe in it. And this is just the first step. After this, we're going to announce a march, another march in 2 months towards affordable housing, because there's a lack of affordable housing that's creating this huge homeless crisis in LA. So that's the plan. We're going to march right at the end. We're going to announce the march for affordable housing, and we're gonna make a difference in LA.
That's our problem. We don't have resources. So that's what we need to do.
Measure H in 90 seconds. This deals with homelessness and your money, so listen up. The County of LA wants to raise the county sales tax by 1/4 cent. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it will be adding to existing sales taxes. So for example, LA City's sales tax would go up to 9%. The sales tax in Long Beach would hit 10%. The tax would bring in about $350 million a year. And what's the money for? It would go to help pay for services for the homeless. Services, not housing. Things like mental health and medical care, drug and alcohol rehab, counseling for battered women, job training, legal aid, financial education, and more. Supporters say these services are crucial, that you can put a roof over someone's head, but without solving deeper problems, they often end up back on the streets. They also say the sales tax hike would work hand in hand with a bond passed last November by LA City voters. That bond pays for construction of affordable housing. This proposed sales tax would pay for services, so it's housing plus services. Gee, did the city and county coordinate? Yeah, they kind of did. Supporters of Measure H say we're at a crisis. 47,000 homeless men, women, and children are living on the streets, shelters, tents, and cars. But critics, including some formerly homeless people, say the sales tax revenue will just go to the same organizations who let homelessness get out of hand in the first place. They say nonprofits on Skid Row have millions of dollars already. Funding is not the issue. Lack of accountability and transparency are the problems. They also point out that the bond that passed last November to build affordable housing will only pay for 10,000 units. That's only about a fourth of what's needed for more than 40,000 homeless people. So it's not realistic to expect that these measures will end homelessness in LA County. To sum up, a yes vote means you are in favor of a sales tax hike of 1/4 cent for services for the homeless. A no vote means you do not want the sales tax to go up. Oh, by the way, Measure H needs 2/3 of the vote to pass.
And yet, in last year, homelessness rose by over 13%. Homelessness is an issue. The problem when you're dealing, what I mean by a political policy problem, is what's underneath it, what's causing it. That becomes the problem. So you can see where there's a two-step process here. One is something has to be identified as a problem, as something that needs to be looked at. And then there's going to be additional argument, and usually the most vociferous arguments are, what's causing this problem? What do we need to remedy this? We're seeing this in the current, in spring 2020. We're looking at people demonstrating in the streets, right, against what they consider to be police violence. So first of all, that issue has to rise up, right, and be seen by millions of people as something that is an issue, something that has to be dealt with. Right? The issue of police shootings went on, or the problem went on for a long time without it being considered a public policy problem. But once you identify it as an issue, now the debate and the fight comes over what actually constitutes the problem. What is it that you need to look at to remedy this? So the discussion about public policy, so much of it hinges on how you define the issue and how you define the problem, because your solutions are all going to be aimed at what you consider to be the causal mechanism of things. So public policy, although sometimes if you get into it, seems fairly dry, we can see around us, especially nowadays, a very contentious issue. And a lot of this dealing with the question of whether or not a problem is systemic, whether there's something in the structure of something, whether it involves with homelessness or police shootings, or whether it's claimed to be an individual problem. There are some people who don't fit in and can't get homes. There are some people who supposedly, this is the argument, supposedly would prefer to be homeless. So it's just an individual situation. Same thing with the police shootings we're talking about, right? Sometimes people are, oh, it's a few bad apples. To move between systemic and individual, or individual to systemic, is sometimes a very big leap. So when you look at public policy, what you should be seeing undergirding it, right, are these really contentious debates about whether something really is an issue that needs to be resolved, and if it is, what the underlying causes are. Slide 5. Democracy and the American constitutional system. You see that the subtitle for this, originally for the book, says Liberty and Order. I put in the versus order, because as I've said, I think they're held usually in tension with one another. You see here two different quotes. One from Benjamin Franklin, a founder of America, who says, "They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." You see a different quote by Edmund Burke, who wrote, "Liberty must be limited in order to be possessed." The Franklin quote is very much oriented towards liberty. The Edmund Burke quote is very much oriented towards order. It's worth noting that Benjamin Franklin is writing around the time of the American Revolution, in which people felt that they were constrained by British rule and by the king, right? And understood that the king gave you some kind of order in society, but that liberty was being stifled. Edmund Burke, on the other hand, is writing around the time of the French Revolution. This is around 1789. You may know something about the French Revolution. This is when the people overthrew the king. You may have heard in terms of the guillotines, people being lined up, put in these wooden carts and being taken over and had their heads chopped off, which, by the way, was actually considered to be a humane thing to do. To kill someone in order, rather than prolonging their death, you just slice their head off really fast, and that was considered humane. But the thing is, what Edmund Burke saw around him and what he thought, what he felt was too much liberty. That too much liberty is not a good thing. Edmund Burke is often considered to be the father of conservatism. And keep in mind, when we talk about conservatism, we'll talk about it a little bit very soon, but conservatism is not what you see now. The Republican Party and the rightward move is not conservatism. Conservatism has some interesting things to say, And it very often feels like there's too much liberty, that it must be ordered in some sense. It's not a license for complete and absolute freedom. And one of the way that liberty is ordered, by the way, according to Edmund Burke and very often conservatives, is to look to the past, what they consider to be the wisdom of the past, and not to move off into an unknown future. The important thing here is that liberty and order, right, actually get their meaning sort of from each other. Right? That which is against order is often considered to be liberty. If there's too much liberty, that which opposes it and tries to contain it in some way is considered to be order. But keep in mind, as we always will discuss in this class, those terms in and of themselves have no meaning. We define them. We decide whether, as I mentioned before, whether demonstrations in the street are an example of prolonging or having liberty, right, and creating liberty, or whether they are a threat to order. And again, you have to define what you mean by those terms. One of the things that certainly underlies our constitutional system is democracy. Rule by the people, self-government. Again, as you can imagine, as we go through the course, we'll be questioning what that means. But as a general term, rule by the people and self-government at this point does seem to suffice. And I gave you this quote here from the preamble to the U.S. Constitution: "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." We discussed a little bit of this when we just talked about the course, this chapter objectives here, the learning objectives for this chapter. What is meant by we, the people? Is it what the majority believe? Is it what everyone believes? Is it possible that what you end up with is the majority then declares themselves to be we the people, and everyone outside is somehow lesser, is somehow attacking an American consensus? You can often think of this in terms of a box. And in this box called America are what is acceptable, our values, our belief systems, okay, those which are seen as dominant and often unquestioned. As one of those values within that box, we believe in rule by the people. We believe in liberty. We believe in individuality. Yet, how much movement do you actually have? Can you move outside the box? Can you bring up in completely different ways of ordering society and think that those are going to be accepted? Or are you allowed some degree of movement, but only within the box? One way of thinking about this in a contemporary issue, right, is the issue of gay marriage. 20, 30 years ago, no one would have considered gay marriage as possible. Right? It seemed like something that was, to some people, utopian, would never come about. Now it has. And a lot of people look at that and say, this is a move of great progress. But think of it this way. What we did is we extended an existing dominant norm, marriage, to include vast numbers of additional people. We didn't change the value, we expanded it. Which again seems like progress. But what about those people who are outside the box? What about people who want to argue against marriage, who find marriage to be an oppressive, constraining institution? I'm not saying you have to feel that way, but you can understand this from a schematic way, which is within the box which believes in marriage, you can move a little bit. You can try to expand that the marriage to other people, but it's very difficult to step outside of the accepted norm of marriage and to argue against it. If you are in the box, if you clearly believe in marriage and see that it was extended to millions of other people, that will certainly seem like a move of progress. If you are someone who doesn't like marriage, who would like us to question the institution of marriage, then expanding it to include millions of other people actually seems like a conservative movement. It seems like one which is stifling different ways of looking at things. Okay. There's no absolute answer to this. I'm trying to indicate to you it's very much a matter of perspective. And it really does depend on whether you see yourself as part of the dominant norm, of part of the dominant consensus, part of we the people. That's going to look very different to you as things move, as opposed to if you're outside the box. If you don't consider yourself part of the dominant norm, you don't consider yourself part of the dominant consensus. And it's very difficult to change established norms once they become, as the word implies, normalized. Right? You don't question marriage. It's just a norm. You can question who it applies to, but you really can't question the norm itself in American society today. And if you try to do that, then you're not part of we the people. So whether or not movement within the box, I'm calling America the box, right, whether it's a move of progress or whether it's a movement that's stifling change, really depends on where you see yourself situated vis-a-vis the American dominant norms and principles. Slide 6. The Constitution as gatekeeper. The framers of our Constitution recognized the need to limit government. Part of this was a practical conclusion that they had lived over here and were living under British rule and felt that that rule was very limiting, very stifling, and very oppressive. But our founding fathers also looked to the history of political theory as the basis for their ideas. And one of the theorists who was perhaps the most influential in early American thought was the British theorist John Locke, who wrote primarily in the late 1600s. And the most famous of his texts, at least in terms of American history, is called the Second Treatise of Government. In fact, in many ways, the preamble to the Declaration of Independence is a summary of the Second Treatise. John Locke hypothesized, that's why I want to indicate not actual reality, but hypothesized, that in terms of figuring out what kind of government you want, you should look at what society would be like, again, hypothetically, if there was no government, if there were no laws. What would people be like? And he called this a state of nature. Again, it is a hypothetical. What if? Right? People lived in this society. What would life be like without government, without laws? And the idea was if you could figure out how people would act without laws, without government, then you could figure out how strong a government you would need. In Locke's state of nature, there is what is called natural law, which he says at some point that everyone understands what natural law is. They live by natural law. These natural laws are just the basic principles of how we should get along with one another, that everyone understands them. What are they? Well, they're a reflection of divine law, which is God's law. In Locke's thinking, we might not know the mind of God. We might not know divine law, but we can know natural law. We can see the world around us and see things that seem violative of that. The example I often point out is that if presumably you were living in the 1940s and the 1950s in the South, and you saw that black people were being forced to go to the back of the bus, you might look at that and say, that's just wrong. There's some kind of basic principle that says that's not right. That was sort of Locke's idea of natural law. It is God's will, but that which is attainable to us. One of the questions we might ask before we go further in this is, what happens then to this notion of natural law, this notion that there are basic fundamental principles that guide us? What happens to that if you remove God? John Locke was a Christian, but it's not Christian theology that's part of this. It's more what's known as deism, D-E-I-S-M, a belief in God. Right? Again, D-E-I-S-M, deism. So God is important here, because if you take God away, then what are your natural law principles? What are they based on? Right? You can see here from the diagram, in a sense, you can look at it as a mobile. God's at the top, divine law hangs from God, and natural law hangs from divine law. I'm in no way indicating yes for religion or no for religion or anything of that sort. I'm simply saying that when we come up with basic principles and we look to John Locke, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What is a self-evident truth? Something that's there in natural law. But our founding fathers did believe that natural law was a reflection of God's law. That's something to think about, because in our politics, very often, we don't want religion. Again, I'm not saying good or bad. I'm simply indicating observationally. We don't want religion, but we still kind of want to hold on to those natural law principles, right? We still want to believe that there's some kind of fundamental beliefs, but where do they come from? Are they just the majority? Are we back now to this problem of we the people? And whatever we the people say is natural law is a fundamental principle, then that's how it functions? Because keep in mind, if you're trying to change things and someone says, well, this is just natural, this is a fundamental principle, there's not much you can do. So on the one hand, natural law seems good. It seems like it's protective of certain kinds of rights. But on the other hand, if you allow natural law, then you allow people who disagree, with whom you disagree completely, to gather together and argue that their position is natural law and doesn't need to be questioned. In Locke's State of Nature, although people understand what natural law is, it turns out they don't. They start out knowing, because you can understand if we were in a pre-governmental situation, if we didn't have government, didn't have laws, and everyone was getting along fairly well, why would we need government? We wouldn't need it. But John Locke is not an anarchist. He's arguing for limited government. So what he says is, people are aware in this state of nature that there are disagreements over natural law, disagreements over its applications. And I've said this to you before, already in this chapter, that underlying so much of America is this contradiction between the principle and its application. Or if not a contradiction, at least a problem of how to apply broad kinds of concepts and beliefs, abstract beliefs. Individuals in Locke's State of Nature had that problem. So they contract together. They make an agreement to leave the state of nature and form government. Government is limited. It is limited by everything that we had in the state of nature, which was life, liberty, property. Property is very important to John Locke. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of property was part of the state of nature. Underlying it also is that we are all reasoning, rational individuals, even though apparently we don't seem to be able to perceive how to apply natural law, but we're all reasoning, rational people. That's a very fundamental belief of what is called Lockean liberalism. If you go to a political science conference, and especially if you're looking at political theory panels, and they say to you, America is a liberal nation, in political theory, they don't mean liberal, left, right, conservative, anything of that sort. What they mean is Lockean liberalism. Individual rights, rational people, limited government. So much of that comes from John Locke. And as I indicated to you just a moment ago, the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Right? What is a self-evident truth? In John Locke's language, natural law. It's there. We all understand it. Just about all of us understand it, even if we don't know how to apply it. Right? All men are created equal, and that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How'd we get that? John Locke said life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Happiness became property, although in some ways happiness and property came very close to each other. Right? But the self-evident truths, the inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness all come from John Locke. There's a very theoretical foundation to American society. But inherent in John Locke right from the beginning is we believe in individuals. We believe in we're very individualistic. Those people in the state of nature were individuals. They were, by the way, white property-owning males. That's what constituted an individual at the time. Right? They don't form group alliances. Right? They're individuals. We're very individualistic. They are reasoning, rational people. We believe that we're reasoning and rational, and yet they could not understand how to apply natural law. That was the problem. And I would suggest to you that to some extent, our problems, I don't mean problem bad, I mean problematics of American society are right there at the beginning in John Locke. We have certain concepts we believe in, and then we fight over their application because John Locke tells us right from the beginning, it's very hard to figure out. We have disagreements over it. We form government, this is according to Locke, because government is supposed to resolve this problem. Government is supposed to be objective. That might seem kind of humorous to us now, but that's how he perceived it. That government would solve these problems, and government, which would be limited by natural law, must obey natural law, right, would then decide how to apply the principles of natural law. The question arose, how do you know the government's doing that? What if the government is being tyrannical? What if it's not applying natural law? And Locke really never had a solution to that. He said people don't revolt very much. It won't happen very much. Right? People will talk to one another. Inherent in John Locke is also a duality that exists in American society, because John Locke was specifically speaking to the moneyed class in Britain at the time and telling them that they should overthrow the king, okay, but not to worry, because the people, the broad people, will not come and take their property, because property is natural, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And if they come take your property, you can kill them because they violated natural law. And this notion of against the power of the king, but never really quite trusting the people, is something which, as we go on and we'll talk about, is really inherent in American thought. It was inherent in the policies and programs of our founding fathers and the way they view the world. Overthrow the king, but worry about the rabble. Slide 7. The Constitution as gatekeeper continued. Direct democracy, in which everyone would vote on every issue, was considered impractical by our founding fathers. Even though at that time there were just the colonies, they perceived our nation as growing, thinking it would move westward, it would have a great number of people. Right? It would just be impossible to have everyone vote on every issue. When people talk about direct democracy, they usually hold up as an ideal what was called the New England Town Hall or the New England Town Meeting, so that when you had a small population in New England back in the 1600s, everyone could get together, vote on every issue. But in a large nation, that was considered impractical. So our founding fathers created what's called representative democracy. Right? We vote for representatives. We vote for our house members. We vote for senators. Right? They supposedly represent our views. To the founding fathers, the representatives would be an elite who would filter the views of the general population. This, again, is a sign of a great deal of wariness and concern about the people. Right? The American people as a whole were seen as impetuous, people who would just move from one position to another, whereas the representatives were considered to be those who would sort of cool things down, who would see the bigger picture, who would supposedly always be interested in the national interest, not in their self-interest. I'll let you judge as to whether that has worked that way. As a matter of fact, when America was created, the Senate, right, senators were elected by state legislatures. They weren't elected by the people. The idea was that the House of Representatives would be the people's house. That's why it's often called that, right? And they would represent, and it would move and shift with what they considered to just be, the vagaries of circumstances and opinion, as we supposedly just move around as people. But the Senate, right, would be the elite. They would be the ones who would calm things down and would always have love of country and be able to see the greater good. Again, there's always that tension. Don't want the king, but don't really trust the people. If you refer to America as a republic, there's actually two aspects to that. The first is representative government, as we just talked about. Not direct democracy, but we elect our representatives. But there's a second aspect historically, and which then comes into America. And you see here a quote by the Roman statesman Cicero. He's one of the people who was looked to in terms of deciding or talking about what a republic is. And he says a republic is, quote, an assemblage of some size associated with one another through agreement on law and community of interest, end quote. In other words, in a way, we the people. That you have to have some commonality of interest, some commonality of what constitutes justice, right, in order to be a republic. Not just an assemblage of some size, you see, not just a group of people, but have certain basic agreements. And there was a disagreement in early American society whether the purpose of America was liberty or whether it was to create civic virtue. We know the general story of people who fled from Europe and came here for political and religious freedom. But there's also an argument that they came here to create a new society, that they came to a society imbued with civic virtue, with better people. John Adams, one of the founders, was much more on the Republic side of this debate. Not so much individual liberty, but rather us seeing ourselves as a whole, caring about one another, seeing ourselves as a common community. And so, again, you have this debate, right, this tension between individual liberty and freedom and we the people. And which was the country founded to promote? It's actually both at the same time. And that's why I think sometimes in our individual politics, you still see this play out. It's a matter of perhaps individual freedom or liberty versus order that we talked about before. How much can you, or to what degree can you be outside of this supposed agreement on law and community of interest? What happens if you're outside of the norm? What happens if you're not part of we the people? So that America is founded so much on individualism and liberty, but it always has this line through it, this we the people, this Republican line. Again, this is not Republican versus Democrats. This is Republicanism in Cicero's sense, which is that we have a commonality of interest. We have agreement. We have the box. And so America is this box. And again, if you move within it, if you're in the box, it looks like there's a lot of movement. If you move outside of it and you look back, all you see is this tiny small box that supposedly is agreement. And of course, we'll have to ask questions about how we know what that agreement is. How have we decided on it? So there is this tension within America, that we've been discussing already so far, between liberty and order, between individual freedom and civic virtue, between individualism and we the people. Slide 8, the Constitution as gatekeeper. As we just discussed, the notion of the Republican aspect of America was to create more virtuous people, that Europe had been in decline, morally in decline, that people were leaving, they were coming here, and part of a republic depended on a good, virtuous population. But the Founding Fathers pushed back against that a bit. And in particular, they decided that the structure of government and how we relate to each other would, instead of having a single moral foundation, our nation would be very mechanistic. This was a time when they were writing in which science was coming to the fore, in which mechanics, looking at the world in that kind of machine-like mechanical way was very big amongst people. And so they looked at this as a matter of trying to balance interests. In other words, they said, you can never have a single public interest. Okay, keep in mind, they still believed in we the people. Okay? But they didn't believe that you could make everyone think alike. A single public interest. It doesn't mean that they were fully against republicanism in the sense that we shouldn't be virtuous. Right? But they decided that the best way to have the country work was to let people have their interest, create more interests, and have people competing with one another. What the Founding Fathers really feared is that there would be a single majority of a population which would take over and just squelch the minority, and the minority would never have any say in things. They feared that the majority would all think alike, they would all group together, the minority would all be stuck together in themselves, right? The minority would find that they had no way to counter the majority other than to try to overthrow the government. In some sense, what the Founding Fathers really feared was that the majority of the population, which was the poor, right, with little to no property, would join together to take property from them, from the wealthy. So what they did was to say, if you have any single dominant majority, have them fractured over a lot of different issues. So let's say it's just property, and you have a class that has all the property, probably a small number of people, and you have a large number of people who have no property. And you might think, oh, those people are going to organize just on the basis of property. That's going to be wealth, and property is going to be the only issue. And again, they feared the majority of the population would be poor and therefore would take their property from the wealthy, from the Founding Fathers. But if there are a whole host of different kinds of issues, so that sometimes the majority, people who have money, are actually aligned with people who don't have money on a different kind of issue, right? And so there'd be all these different groups that were forming. There wouldn't be one group over another group. So they believed that if you could have more interests, not try to have one unifying interest, but more interests, cross-cutting, right? So everyone would belong to different groups and groups would be aligned differently. There'd be no single dominant majority who shared all the same interests. And where you see this most is in one of the Federalist Papers. When the Constitution was written and it needed to be ratified, some of the founding fathers, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, wrote these pamphlets that they distributed, talking about the Constitution, talking about the government and why things should be set up a certain way. A lot of it was very theoretical, some of it was very practical, and over time those pamphlets have been collected into something called the Federalist Papers. That's what it means. Federalist meaning federal government. They were talking about writing a constitution, so they wrote these called the Federalist Papers. You can find them. They're in public domain in many various ways. And two of the most famous papers are Federalist 10, which we're talking about here, and then in a moment we'll talk about Federalist 51. Federalist 10 is about factions. And here a faction is defined as, quote, a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority, who are united and actuated by some common impulse or passion, adverse to the rights of other citizens. Kind of like an interest group, right? Who are looking at their interests, and it doesn't mean that they're negative to other people, it just means they have their interests, and other people are going to have their interests, and there will be this sort of adversarial relation. And so in Federalist 10, right, it's discussed why you want to have more factions, why it's good to have factions, right? And also why you ultimately want to have a representative government with the elites, right? Remember we talked about that. And so the elites as our representatives. So both of these aspects, the cross-cutting citizens and the representative government, the elites, were supposed to mitigate this problem of what happens if the vast majority of people who are poorer get together and start taking things from the wealthy. But again, you see here this underlying tension between more cross-cutting factions, more competition of ideas, so that no single idea could predominate, and yet still this notion of we the people. Sometimes we the people isn't even seen as a faction. Remember, we just talked about natural law, things becoming norms, becoming normalized. And so we the people often doesn't even seem like it's an interest group. To believe in marriage, is that an interest group? No, it just seems like an underlying norm. We can see that in terms of things like capitalism. It's very difficult to argue against capitalism. People who are capitalists don't see themselves as a faction. In fact, they don't even recognize those who might argue against capitalism as a competing faction. They just think this capitalism is the norm. It's based on individualism. It's based on John Locke. So much of it comes from that, and that constitutes we the people. So this notion of factions doesn't necessarily counter this underlying conception, this underlying agreement, the box. And in a way, factions are disagreements within the box. Right? Whether marriage should be just for heterosexual people or whether it should be for anyone. Right? That's an argument within the box of marriage. So there is this, I want you to see as we're going through this tension that exists between the kind of Republican aspects of we the people and this kind of notion of individual freedom, mechanistic competing of factions. And again, I said to you before, lots of times it depends on where you believe you are situated and your own particular perspective. If you are within the box, right, if capitalism seems to you to be the system without any other alternative, then fine gradations of capitalism, right, will seem to you like as though there are great changes. If you're outside the box, right, and you look and you see a small change within it, or what seems to you to be a small change within it, that's not going to seem like a major change at all. Right? For example, think about what we commonly call as Obamacare, right? The Affordable Care Act. To a lot of people, the Affordable Care Act is a great move forward. It includes a great number of people, more people who would get health insurance otherwise. It allows people to come together to purchase health insurance, right, from companies as a unit. It lowers costs. So it would seem like if you believe that health insurance is going to be inherently a matter of private insurance companies, then again, what's called Obamacare is a great move forward. If you're outside of the box of corporatized healthcare and look at that and say, well, there should be universal healthcare, then Obamacare doesn't look like a move of great progress. It looks like a movement of conserving what already exists in terms of corporatized healthcare. So whether you're inside the box or outside the box really depends on your perspective. And of course, I'm just sure you understand as we go through this, that the notion that there is a box and that there are some people in it and some people outside of it is itself a perspective. It's not a claim of reality, but it's a way of organizing our thought so that we can see changes taking place, but change itself, right? Whether Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is a movement of change, whether it's a movement of progress, becomes very much a matter of perspective, which means that all of us, especially you who are listening to this, have to be very self-aware of our own position and our own perspectives when we're making those kinds of judgments. Slide 9. Factions continued. Our founding fathers were most concerned about majority factions. A majority of people, remember as I mentioned to you before, to some degree they felt like the poor who would come and take their property from them, the elite, the representatives. They felt that a minority opinion wouldn't cause much problem because the majority could defeat it. But as we've seen very often in our country, a minority that's well organized, that for whom a particular issue is an overwhelming issue for them, can often get their way or at least sort of gum up the works, if you know what I mean, in terms of the majority. Because let's take an issue such as gun control. The majority of people, a very high percentage of people, believe that there should be gun control. But for them, it may not be the overriding decision in their lives, or the overriding issue in their lives. They may be cross-cut by a number of different factions, and so they're pulled in a number of different directions. However, there may be a very small, committed minority of people who are very vehemently against gun control. That is the issue for them, and so they organize around that issue against gun control in a way that those who are in favor of gun control are sort of split amongst many different issues. Different issues may have a priority for them. So our founding fathers did look to defeat majorities, but it does seem like one of the big problems we have nowadays is a very dedicated minority for whom a particular issue is the issue for them, and they are not split apart by different cross-cutting factions, at least not from that issue. And that's not a problem that our founding fathers were necessarily oriented towards. Slide 10. The Constitution as gatekeeper continued. The Constitution divides power both within the federal government and between the federal government and the states. When we say power is divided horizontally, we mean within the federal government. We mean the three branches of government. Here, too, the division of power was both a combination of political theory and political thought, and was a matter of compromise coming out of the Constitutional Convention. The theory part is seen in Federalist 51, in which it said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If you could live in a state of nature and have no government, no laws, and everybody could get along with one another, you wouldn't need government. The problem with Locke's state of nature is when people couldn't agree on a natural law, it fell into fights and disagreements, and so people's property was at stake. The same thing that our founding fathers were concerned about. So they came to the idea that men are not angels, right? That men do not just naturally follow natural law, so you have to have government. And then within government, Right? Ambition must be made to counter ambition, right? Which really means checks and balances. You couldn't just have three branches and give power to each branch and assume that they would not exceed their power, that they would limit themselves. The idea was that no government branch is ever going to do that. So you had to put them, in a sense, in competition with one another. That's what's meant by ambition must be made to counter ambition. Based on this idea, and as you'll see, coming out of the compromises during the Constitutional Convention, we have three branches of government. We have a legislative branch which makes laws, an executive branch which executes the laws, and a judicial branch which interprets the laws. We'll be talking a great deal more about this as we go through the course. We have separation of powers, meaning each branch has separate and independent powers. As I just said, makes, executes, or interprets. Those are different powers. And then we have checks and balances. Each branch has some power over the others, right? The legislative branch makes laws. The executive, the president, can veto those laws. Then it goes back to the legislative branch, which, under certain circumstances, can override that veto, create a law, and then the judicial branch interprets those laws and decides whether or not they're constitutional. And as we'll see, we'll talk about how that power to interpret the laws came about. So in addition to dividing power horizontally amongst the three branches, power is also divided vertically. What that means is there is a federal government, a national government, and there are state governments. And the relationship between the national government and the state government is often called federalism. As we'll see when we go through the course, that the federalism and how it's been constituted and how power has been divided between the national and state governments has changed over time, moves back and forth. Sometimes the national government is favored. Sometimes a more decentralized state government is favored. So this is just a brief overview as we're going to go into things, but to make sure we understand that, again, power is divided between the branches of the federal government. So we have three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. And there is separation of those powers, and there are also checks and balances. Ambition must be made to counter ambition. And there's also federalism, how power is divided between the national government and the state governments. Slide 11 is just a representation of the three branches of government. Again, you can see the legislative branch, that's Congress, the executive branch, which is the president, you see the White House, and then the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, and there are various courts underneath the various federal courts underneath the Supreme Court. We'll talk later about that, about how those courts came about.